Sarah Mitchell sat in the back seat of her grandmother's worn Civic, her small forehead pressed against the cool window as rain streaked the glass. Outside, Louisville's urban landscape blurred into a watercolor painting of grays and blacks, reflecting the storm both outside and within the vehicle. The 3-year-old clutched her teddy bear, a ratty, brown thing named Mr. Snuggles with one button eye hanging by a thread, as if it were the last solid thing in an increasingly unstable world. Her grandmother kept one eye on the road and one eye on Sarah through the mirror, her weathered face etched with concern that had become permanent these past few weeks. Sarah's life, once simple and predictable, had shattered into fragments that no longer fit together. Just 3 months ago, she'd lived in a 2-story colonial house with white shutters on Maple Avenue. She'd had her own room with walls painted a soft pink, decorated with Disney princess stickers and glow-in-the-dark stars her father had arranged in constellations. She'd had routines that made sense: breakfast with her mother, afternoon playtime in the backyard, evening stories with her father before bed. That life felt like a fairy tale now, something that had happened to a different Sarah in a different world. The catalyst for everything had been subtle at first. Sarah's mother, Jennifer, had noticed small things that most people might have overlooked: a comment here, a change in behavior there. Sarah had begun waking up in the middle of the night crying, something she'd never done before. She'd started having accidents during the day, regressing to diapers even though she'd been successfully potty trained for months. Most concerning was the way Sarah's body would go rigid whenever her father, Michael, raised his voice, even if he was just calling her to dinner or asking about her day. Jennifer had first mentioned these observations to Michael gently, thinking perhaps they could work through whatever was causing Sarah's distress together. But Michael had dismissed her concerns, attributing them to nothing more than Sarah being a dramatic toddler going through phases. "Kids are weird," he'd said with a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "She'll grow out of it." But Jennifer's maternal instincts, that powerful, almost psychic connection mothers often have with their children, told her something was profoundly wrong. The turning point came on a Tuesday evening in March. Sarah's pediatrician, Dr. Rachel, had noticed bruises on Sarah's upper arms during a routine checkup. They were faint but unmistakable, finger-shaped marks suggesting someone had grabbed the child with enough force to leave impressions. When Doctor gently asked Sarah how she'd gotten the bruises, the little girl had gone completely silent, her eyes darting nervously as if she were terrified of saying the wrong thing. She'd simply shaken her head and buried her face in her mother's neck, refusing to speak. Doctor had pulled Jennifer aside and, with measured professionalism but unmistakable concern, explained that she was legally obligated to report this to Child Protective Services. Jennifer's world had tilted on its axis. She confronted Michael that night, her voice shaking with anger and fear. Michael had exploded, denying everything vehemently. He claimed he'd never touched Sarah in anger, that perhaps she'd gotten the bruises from playing, from falling, from something completely innocent. The argument had escalated into the worst fight they'd had in their 7-year marriage. With accusations flying back and forth like weapons neither could control. But Jennifer had made her decision. Whatever was happening, Sarah's safety came first. She'd called a domestic violence hotline the next morning while Michael was at work, speaking to a counselor in hushed tones while Sarah watched cartoons in the next room. The counselor had walked her through her options, explaining that filing for custody didn't necessarily mean accusing Michael of abuse. It meant protecting her daughter while a proper investigation took place. Jennifer had felt sick to her stomach, but she'd also felt resolved. She couldn't ignore this. She couldn't play pretend that everything was fine. The custody petition had been filed on a Thursday. Michael had received the papers at work, and according to his brother who'd witnessed it, he'd become furious and nearly incoherent with rage. He'd immediately hired a lawyer, an aggressive man named Robert who specialized in contested custody cases and was known for playing dirty. Within days, Michael had filed a counterpetition claiming Jennifer was the one being abusive, specifically, that she was emotionally manipulating Sarah and attempting to alienate him from his daughter. Now, 3 months later, everything was fractured beyond recognition. Sarah spent alternating weeks with each parent, though even those arrangements had become complicated. Her father had insisted on overnight visitation, despite her obvious anxiety about it. Her mother had reluctantly, not wanting to be seen as the unreasonable one in court. Sarah's preschool had called multiple times expressing concern about her emotional state and behavioral regression. Her teacher, Miss, had gently suggested that Sarah might benefit from meeting with the school counselor. As pulled into her driveway, Sarah still hadn't spoken a word during the entire drive. The little girl's silence had become increasingly common, a protective mechanism her young mind had developed to keep herself safe in an environment that no longer felt safe. Parked the car carefully and turned to look at her granddaughter properly for the first time since picking her up from Jennifer's apartment. Sarah's eyes were red-rimmed and swollen from crying. Her hair, usually bouncy and meticulously braided by Jennifer, hung limp and tangled. She wore a dinosaur t-shirt that was slightly too large, clearly borrowed from her father's collection, and it emphasized how small and fragile she looked. But what broke her heart most was the expression on her granddaughter's face. There was no spark of childhood wonder in those eyes anymore, no mischievous glint or silly smile. Instead, there was resignation, a defeated acceptance of a world that had become unpredictable and frightening. "Come on, sweetie," said softly, unbuckling the car seat herself because Sarah seemed unable to do even simple tasks anymore. "Let's get inside. I made chocolate chip cookies, and we can watch your favorite movie." Sarah nodded mechanically, moving like a small robot through the motions of living without actually engaging with life. That night, as Sarah lay in guest room, a room that had become more home to her than either of her parents' houses, she lay awake for hours. Her small body was exhausted, but her mind wouldn't quiet down. She wondered why Daddy got so angry. She wondered if she'd done something wrong. She wondered if Mommy and Daddy still loved her, or if she'd broken their love by being bad somehow. These were the thoughts that plagued a 3-year-old who was far too young to process what was happening to her, yet burdened with the weight of it all. Around midnight, Sarah finally fell into a troubled sleep, her dreams filled with shadows and raised voices and the overwhelming feeling of never quite being safe, no matter where she was or who was holding her. In her sleep, she whimpered softly, her body twitching with nightmares she couldn't escape, and who was lying awake in the next room quietly wept for her grandchild's lost innocence. The county courthouse stood like a fortress of justice on Main Street, its limestone facade weathered by decades of Kentucky rain and countless human dramas played out within its walls. Monday morning arrived and cold, the kind of October day that felt heavy with consequence. Inside the building, on the 3rd floor in courtroom 3C, Judge sat alone in her chambers, surrounded by leather-bound law books and the accumulated weight of 30 years of judicial decisions. Before her lay the case file for Mitchell v. Mitchell, a custody dispute that had somehow managed to become both heartbreaking and infuriatingly opaque at the same time. Judge was 63 years old, with silver hair that she wore in a neat bob and reading glasses that perpetually hung from a beaded chain around her neck. She'd been married for 38 years to a retired accountant named Robert, and they had 3 adult children and 5. She understood family. She understood love, commitment, compromise, and the terrible complexity of relationships that began with promise and somehow derailed into something unrecognizable. She also understood the damage that could be inflicted on children caught in the crossfire of adult conflict. She'd spent the weekend reviewing the case materials obsessively, unable to shake a sense of profound unease. The allegations were serious but frustratingly vague. Michael Mitchell's attorney, Robert, presented character witnesses. A former colleague who swore Michael was the most patient and gentle man he knew, Michael's sister that he was a devoted father, even his former basketball coach from high school who claimed Michael had exceptional emotional control and sportsmanship. It was all very compelling and very carefully constructed. Jennifer Mitchell's attorney, a younger woman named Sarah who seemed genuinely invested in her client's case, presented her own evidence. Sarah's preschool teacher about the behavioral regression, the pediatrician about the bruises, and Sarah's frightened response. Jennifer's sister described incidents where she'd witnessed Michael becoming unreasonably angry over minor issues, a spilled glass of milk resulting in 20 minutes of shouting, a question about his workday met with sarcasm and sharp words that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. A therapist who had conducted a preliminary evaluation of Sarah about signs of anxiety and emotional trauma, consistent with exposure to aggression, though she was careful not to speculate about the exact source. But here was the problem, and it gnawed at Judge constantly. None of this evidence definitively proved what Jennifer claimed. There were no hospital reports documenting abuse. There were no photographs of severe injuries. There were no recordings of Michael being abusive. The bruises could, theoretically, have come from innocent play. The behavioral changes in Sarah could be attributed to the stress of the custody battle itself rather than behavior that preceded it. Michael had never been arrested. He had no history of violence. On paper, he looked like a man being falsely accused by an ex-wife trying to gain leverage in custody negotiations. Yet something in Judge's gut, that inexplicable judicial intuition honed by 3 decades of reading people, situations, and the spaces between the truth and the lies, told her that Michael was not being entirely honest. There was something in the way he responded to questions, a defensiveness that seemed excessive. There was something in the way he spoke about Sarah, a possessiveness masked as devotion. And there was something profoundly wrong with how Sarah herself responded to his presence in the courtroom. The little girl had been brought to court by her mother, as was standard in custody cases. At 3 years old, Sarah was too young to testify, but her presence was important, letting the judge observe how she interacted with each parent. When Michael had arrived this morning, Sarah had immediately tensed. She'd climbed into her mother's lap despite having been sitting quietly just moments before. When Michael tried to wave at his daughter, Sarah had buried her face in Jennifer's shoulder and begun to cry softly. Judge had noted the response carefully. It was a reaction born of something more than the general stress of a custody hearing. There was genuine fear there, genuine avoidance. When Jennifer held Sarah, the little girl's body relaxed incrementally, though she remained anxious. The contrast was unmistakable. Now, as she sat alone in her chambers drinking cold coffee that had been sitting on her desk since early morning, Judge wrestled with the central dilemma of her career. She needed to make a decision that would profoundly affect this child's future, and the evidence before her was simply insufficient. Conviction in family court didn't require the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt that criminal court demanded, but she still felt an enormous responsibility to get this right. Sarah Mitchell's entire childhood, her sense of safety, her ability to trust, all of it hung in the balance. She thought about her own. Her youngest grandson, Timothy, was 4 years old, almost exactly Sarah's age. She'd spent last weekend with him, helping him build an elaborate fort out of couch cushions, reading him stories about dragons and princesses, listening to his innocent observations about the world. The thought of Timothy being frightened, confused about his safety, caught between 2 people claiming to love him, it made her chest ache with a ferocity that transcended the professional distance she usually maintained from her cases. At 9:47 a.m., Judge made a decision that would astonish everyone involved in the case. She called her clerk and requested an emergency meeting with both attorneys before the proceedings began. When Robert and Sarah arrived in her chambers, both suspicious and nervous about what this unexpected summons might mean, Judge laid out a proposal that made both attorneys' jaws drop. "I need to hear the truth," she said firmly, her voice leaving no room for negotiation. "And I don't believe this child can tell us the truth while she's terrified. The evidence is conflicting. The testimony is circumstantial, but that little girl knows something and her fear is telling me something crucial. I'm proposing we bring in a certified therapy dog, not to intimidate or confuse the child, but to create a safe environment where she might actually communicate what she's experienced. Robert immediately objected, his face reddening with indignation. "Your Honor, that's highly irregular. It's manipulative. It will prejudice the court against my client." "It will," Judge interrupted calmly, "reveal the truth. That's my job, mister. That's what I'm sworn to do. If your client has nothing to fear from an honest conversation between a child and a trained professional in the presence of a calming animal, then you have nothing to worry about." Sarah remained quiet, but Judge could see the hope flickering in her eyes. She understood what the judge was attempting to do. "I've already contacted the Louisville Police Department," Judge continued. "Officer James and his K-9 partner, Justice, are trained in trauma-informed care for children. They've worked with law enforcement, hospitals, and court systems across the country. Justice is not an attack dog. He's not here to threaten anyone. He's here to help a frightened child feel safe enough to be honest." Sputtered further protests, but Judge had already made up her mind. She rarely reversed her decisions once they were made. The case would proceed in an unconventional way, and if it resulted in an appeal based on procedural irregularities, so be it. She could live with an appeal. She couldn't live with making the wrong decision about a child's safety based on insufficient evidence and her own doubts. By 10:30 a.m., Officer and Justice were en route to the courthouse. Judge sat back in her chair, closed her eyes for just a moment, and prayed silently that she was making the right choice. In just a few hours, a 3-year-old girl and a 4-year-old dog would be asked to do what lawyers, doctors, and social workers could not: reveal an uncomfortable truth that would shake everyone in that courtroom to their core. Officer James arrived at the county courthouse at precisely 10:52 a.m., 14 minutes before the courtroom reconvened. He sat in his police cruiser in the parking lot, holding Justice's lead loosely, both man and dog calm and centered despite the unusual circumstances. Had been a K-9 handler for 8 years, but this was his first time being called upon for something like this: a custody case, a therapeutic intervention, a legal proceeding where the stakes involved a child's entire future rather than criminal investigation or security work. He was a man of medium height with warm brown eyes and an easy demeanor that somehow managed to project both authority and compassion simultaneously. His uniform was impeccable, his demeanor professional, but there was something fundamentally kind about him that immediately put people at ease. At 34 years old, he'd become one of the most respected K-9 officers in the Louisville Police Department, not just for his technical skills, but for his intuitive understanding of the psychological dimensions of police work. Justice, his partner of 4 years, was a magnificent specimen of German Shepherd, 4 years old, 85 pounds of lean muscle and intelligence. His coat was a rich sable color with subtle black markings, and his eyes held a level of awareness that seemed almost prescient. Justice had been trained in multiple disciplines: detection work for narcotics and explosives, protection and patrol, search and rescue, and more recently, therapeutic intervention with trauma-affected children and domestic violence survivors. Justice had an almost supernatural ability to sense emotional distress in humans and respond with intuitive gentleness, a quality that couldn't really be trained but only recognized, cultivated, and refined. Had received the call from Judge's clerk just 3 hours earlier. At first, he'd been skeptical. He'd done demonstrations at schools and community centers where children could interact with justice in controlled environments, and he'd participated in crisis situations where Justice's calming presence had helped de-escalate tense situations. But a custody hearing was different. This wasn't a criminal investigation. This was a family in crisis, and he was being asked to essentially serve as an emotional translator between a frightened child and a legal system trying to determine her future. When Judge had explained what she needed, had felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders like a physical thing. She wasn't asking him to be a police officer or a security presence. She was asking him to be something more nuanced, a facilitator of emotional truth, a bridge between a child's inner experience and the adult world's need for evidence and testimony. It was a role he'd never officially been trained for, but it aligned with something fundamental in his approach to both law enforcement and life in general. The belief that sometimes the most powerful truth required compassion rather than authority. He'd called his supervisor, Captain, to get permission to attend the hearing in uniform. "This is highly irregular," had said, but there was understanding in her voice. She'd worked with long enough to know that his instincts were generally sound. "Keep justice calm, keep yourself professional, and for God's sake, don't let the dog become a distraction rather than a help. If this backfires, it's going to reflect on the entire department." "I understand," Captain had replied. "I won't let you down." Now, as he and Justice sat in the parking lot, reviewed his approach mentally. Judge had been clear about parameters. He shouldn't coach Sarah or lead her toward particular answers. He should simply create a safe environment and observe her responses. His role was to witness and document, not to interrogate. Justice, meanwhile, would simply be Justice, a calm, loving presence that had a remarkable ability to help traumatized individuals access their emotions without the layers of fear that typically complicated human interaction. Took a deep breath, clipped Justice's lead more securely, and exited the vehicle. The October air was crisp and carried the smell of rain. Thunder rumbled in the distance, suggesting a storm was rolling in, weather that somehow felt thematically appropriate for what was about to happen inside the courthouse. As they walked through the courthouse corridors, became acutely aware of the stares they attracted. Police officers with dogs weren't uncommon in Louisville, but seeing one walking through the courthouse, clearly not there for a routine security check, prompted whispers and curious looks. Ignored the attention, his focus entirely on justice and the task ahead. Judge's clerk, a woman named who'd been working in the courthouse for 23 years, smiled warmly when she saw them arrive. "The judge will be pleased," she said. "Court is about to reconvene. They're all waiting in the courtroom now." She gestured down the hallway. "Are you ready for this, officer?" "As ready as I'll be," replied, and then added, "Justice has handled stranger situations. We'll be fine." But as he approached the courtroom doors, felt his own pulse quicken slightly. He'd handled high-stakes police situations, armed standoffs, dangerous suspects, critical search and rescue operations where lives hung in the balance. But this was different. There were no weapons to neutralize here, no criminals to apprehend. Instead, there was a small, frightened child whose entire future depended on being able to access and communicate an emotional truth that she barely understood herself. The courtroom doors loomed ahead. Through the small window in the upper portion of the door, could see the judge at her bench, the attorneys at their tables, the parents sitting with visible tension, and in the corner, a small figure coloring with crayons. Sarah Mitchell, the little girl whose vulnerability had somehow managed to penetrate an entire legal system and demand a more compassionate approach. Paused at the threshold, placed his hand on Justice's head and felt the dog's solid, reassuring presence. "Okay, buddy," he whispered. "Let's go help a little girl find her courage." He pushed open the courtroom door, and the conversation that had been quietly continuing throughout the room immediately ceased. All eyes turned toward him and Justice. Could see the range of reactions. Judge's calm acknowledgement, Jennifer's hopeful expression mixed with anxiety, Michael's face draining of color, the attorney's various expressions of surprise and strategic calculation. But most importantly, he saw little Sarah freeze mid-crayon stroke, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of the large dog entering her world. Justice moved with practiced calm, his training evident in every measured step. He didn't pull on the lead or display any of the behaviors that might frighten a child. Instead, he walked beside with quiet dignity, his presence commanding attention not through aggression but through an almost tangible aura of purposeful calm. Judge banged her gavel once, a gentle but authoritative sound that brought complete silence to the courtroom. "Thank you for being here, officer," she said formally. "I believe you understand the nature of what we're asking here." "I do, Your Honor," replied, keeping his voice steady and professional. "Justice and I are ready to assist however we can." The judge nodded, then gestured toward Sarah. "Perhaps we should begin then, whenever you're ready, officer." Took a breath, knelt down slowly to make himself less physically imposing, and allowed Justice to move at his own pace toward the frightened 3-year-old sitting in the corner. What happened next would reverberate through the courtroom, through Louisville's legal system, and ultimately, through an entire child's life in ways that none of them could yet predict. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath as Officer slowly approached Sarah with Justice at his side. The little girl had frozen mid-crayon stroke, her small hand suspended inches above the coloring book spread across her lap. Her eyes were enormous, tracking the large dog with a mixture of fear and fascination that only a child can experience, that delicate balance between instinctive caution and innate curiosity about the unknown. Justice, with the intuitive awareness that had made him exceptional in his therapeutic work, immediately understood the assignment. He slowed his already measured pace even further, lowering his body posture to make himself appear smaller and less threatening. His ears, which usually stood alert, relaxed slightly. His tail wagged with a gentle, deliberate rhythm, rather than the enthusiastic thrashing that characterized his usual greeting style. Every movement was calculated to communicate safety, acceptance, and non-judgment. Sarah's grandmother, who had been sitting in the gallery behind Jennifer, leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped together with white-knuckled intensity. She'd been present through every hearing, every custody exchange, every moment of Sarah's deterioration over the past 3 months. She watched this moment unfold with an almost spiritual intensity, as if she could sense that something pivotal was occurring. Officer positioned himself about 6 feet from where Sarah sat, far enough away to avoid overwhelming her, but close enough for her to see that he wasn't presenting any threat. He knelt down on one knee, a posture that brought him to approximately Sarah's eye level. Justice settled beside him, sitting with perfect posture, his entire body language communicating calm authority. If a dog could project competence and trustworthiness, Justice was doing it flawlessly. "Hello, Sarah," Officer said softly, his voice warm but not condescending. He was careful not to use the exaggerated baby talk that some adults employed with young children, that infantilizing tone that made children feel smaller and less capable than they already felt. Instead, he spoke to her as he would speak to anyone with genuine respect. "My name is Officer. This is Justice. He's a very special dog." Sarah's crayon dropped from her trembling fingers and rolled across the floor. She didn't pick it up. Instead, she stared at Justice with an intensity that suggested she was processing far more than what her 3-year-old vocabulary could articulate. There was something in Justice's eyes, an intelligence, a gentleness, an almost transcendent acceptance, that seemed to reach into whatever guarded space Sarah had constructed around her wounded heart. Michael shifted nervously in his seat. His attorney, Robert, placed a cautionary hand on his arm, silently warning him to remain still. Any sudden movement, any audible reaction might disrupt whatever was happening between the child and the dog. "Justice is a police dog," continued, speaking slowly and clearly, "but he has a very important job. His job is to help people feel brave. He helps people who are scared or sad or confused. That's his special talent." Paused, allowing his words to settle into the silence. "Justice doesn't judge people. He doesn't get angry. He doesn't yell. He just wants to help people feel safe." Sarah's body, which had been rigid with tension, began to relax almost imperceptibly. Officer noticed the shift immediately. It was exactly the kind of subtle change he'd been trained to observe. The little girl's shoulders dropped fractionally. Her breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, began to deepen slightly. "Would you like to meet Justice?" asked. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation, a genuine question that respected Sarah's autonomy and her right to choose her own comfort level. Sarah looked at her mother as if seeking permission. Jennifer nodded encouragingly, though she remained silent. She understood that her voice, her visible emotion, might complicate what was happening between her daughter and the dog. Whatever this was, it needed to unfold in its own time, in its own way. Sarah stood up slowly, leaving her coloring book on the chair. She was wearing a small pink dress that hung loosely on her frame. She'd lost weight over the past 3 months, something her pediatrician had noted with concern. Her white socks were slightly mismatched, and her shoes were untied, hanging loose on her feet. She looked fragile in a way that should never be associated with a 3-year-old child, but fragility hung about her like a tangible aura. She took one tentative step toward Justice, then another. Her small hands were clenched into fists at her sides, as if she were gathering every ounce of courage required for this simple action. Officer remained perfectly still, allowing Justice to be the focal point of Sarah's attention and movement. When Sarah was approximately 3 feet away from Justice, she stopped. She stood frozen, her eyes locked on the dog's eyes. In that moment, something extraordinary seemed to pass between them, a recognition, perhaps, that they were both beings who understood fear and uncertainty but were willing to move forward despite it. Justice made the next move. With deliberate gentleness, he extended his nose toward Sarah's outstretched hand. It was a gesture of greeting, of introduction, of peaceful intention. Sarah's small fingers trembled as they made contact with the dog's soft nose. She gasped slightly at the sensation, the warmth of the dog's breath, the velvet texture of his nose, the undeniable reality of another living being choosing to connect with her. And then something miraculous happened. Sarah smiled. It was a genuine smile, not the mechanical expression she'd been producing for weeks, but a real, authentic smile that transformed her entire face. Her eyes, which had been dull and anxious for so long, suddenly held a spark of something alive, something hopeful. "Hi, Justice," she whispered in a voice so small it was barely audible. Yet in the courtroom's absolute silence, every person heard it clearly. Judge's expression softened. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears, not tears of sadness, but something more complex, something that contained both sorrow for what her daughter had been through and hope for what might emerge from this moment. Officer gently encouraged Justice to sit beside Sarah rather than standing over her. Justice immediately, settling into a relaxed sitting position that allowed Sarah to stroke his fur at eye level rather than having to reach up. The little girl's trembling fingers began their gentle exploration of Justice's coat, running across his back, feeling the solid warmth of his body, experiencing the undeniable comfort of unconditional acceptance. "Justice can feel when people are scared," Officer said softly, continuing to narrate the moment in a way that validated what Sarah was experiencing. "And he wants to help you feel safe. That's what he's really good at." He paused, watching Sarah's hands become less trembling, more confident as they moved across Justice's fur. Justice knows that sometimes it's hard for people to tell the truth when they're scared, but Justice helps people be brave enough to tell the truth. That's his special gift. Sarah continued stroking Justice's fur, her entire demeanor transformed by the simple, pure connection she'd established with the dog. Her breathing had normalized. Her shoulders, which had been hunched up around her ears for weeks, had relaxed into a more natural position. It was as if Justice was somehow drawing the fear out of her, absorbing it into his patient, accepting presence. In the gallery, whispered a silent prayer of gratitude. In the attorney's section, Robert began calculating the implications of what he was witnessing. Michael stared at the scene unfolding before him with an expression that cycled through anger, anxiety, and a desperate hope that somehow this wouldn't go where it seemed to be heading. Judge made notes on her legal pad, but her eyes never left Sarah and Justice. She'd taken a risk bringing the dog into her courtroom, disrupting centuries of legal precedent and procedure. But watching a frightened child find a moment of peace and safety through connection with a gentle animal, she knew with absolute certainty that she'd made the right decision. Whatever came next, whatever Sarah might say or reveal, would emerge from a place of relative safety rather than overwhelming terror. The connection between a 3-year-old girl and a 4-year-old dog had created a space where truth could finally emerge. Officer allowed several minutes to pass as Sarah continued stroking Justice's fur. Both child and dog locked in a moment of quiet communion that seemed to exist outside the normal confines of time and courtroom procedure. Judge didn't interrupt. She understood that this was necessary, that Sarah needed to establish trust and safety before any questions could be asked, before any truth could be extracted from the depths of a frightened child's consciousness. Observed Sarah's nonverbal cues with the intensity of someone trained to read what words couldn't express. Her breathing had become rhythmic and calm. The tension that had resided in her small shoulders had mostly dissipated. Her eyes, which had been darting nervously around the courtroom just minutes before, had become focused and peaceful. She'd even begun to hum a little, some wordless melody that seemed to emerge from a place of contentment rather than anxiety. But also knew something crucial that most people in the courtroom didn't fully understand. This moment of peace was delicate, fragile, and temporary. If he waited too long to ask his questions, Sarah might drift into a state of such relaxation that she'd become resistant to engaging with difficult topics. The window of opportunity, that precious moment where she felt safe enough to be honest but alert enough to articulate her truth, was a narrow one. He needed to read that window precisely and act when the moment was right. After approximately 4 minutes since the shift, Sarah's humming had faded to silence. Her eyes had taken on a glazed quality as if she were beginning to drift. This was the moment, not before, not after, but now. He took a breath and began to speak, keeping his voice at the same soft, warm tone he'd been using all along. "Sarah," he said gently, "I need to ask you something very important, something that Justice needs to know so he can help you be brave." He paused, allowing her to process his words. Justice is really good at knowing when people are telling the truth. He can always tell. It's like a superpower he has. Sarah looked up from Justice's fur, her eyes meeting. There was something profound in her gaze, a child's innate wisdom combined with the weight of circumstances far too heavy for someone so young to bear. "Justice knows that sometimes people don't tell the truth because they're scared," continued carefully. "But Justice wants you to know something very important." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping even lower. "The truth is always safe with Justice. No matter what the truth is, Justice will help make sure you're okay." Sarah's small hand stilled on Justice's fur. She was listening intently now, understanding on some level that this was different from casual conversation. This was serious. This was important. In the gallery, held her breath. Jennifer gripped the edge of her seat so tightly her knuckles turned white. Judge leaned slightly forward, every muscle in her body tense with anticipation. Michael's attorney whispered something urgently to his client, but Michael appeared frozen, unable to speak or move. "Sarah," officer said, and now his voice carried a quality of gentle authority, "I need to ask you a very important question, and Justice wants you to answer with the truth, no matter what. Are you ready to be that brave?" Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. "When you're at home with your daddy," asked, the words deliberate and carefully chosen, "do you feel safe?" The courtroom exploded into absolute silence. This was it. This was the moment that would determine everything that followed. Every attorney, every judge, every family member understood the weight of this single question and the answer that might follow. Sarah's body stiffened. Observed the physical response immediately, the tension that returned to her small frame, the way her hand trembled on Justice's fur. She looked toward her father, her eyes darting to him involuntarily. Michael's face was completely pale, his jaw clenched so tightly it appeared his teeth might crack under the pressure. Then Sarah's gaze shifted to her mother. Jennifer's face was streaked with tears, her mouth open as if she wanted to speak, but was forcing herself to remain silent, understanding that any intervention from her might complicate what needed to happen. Sarah looked back at Justice, and something in the dog's steady, accepting presence seemed to anchor her. Justice's tail wagged slowly, deliberately, as if the dog were silently communicating. "You're safe. Tell the truth. I'm here." Sarah took a shaky breath. Her small lips trembled. When she opened her mouth to speak, her voice was barely audible, a tiny whisper that somehow carried through the courtroom with absolute clarity. "Not always." 2 words, 3 syllables, but they fell into that courtroom like an explosion of truth that could not be contained, minimized, or explained away. For a moment there was no sound at all. Even the ambient courthouse noises, the distant hum of fluorescent lights, the faint sound of traffic outside, the building's subtle creaks and groans, seemed to pause in respect for the profound weight of what had just been spoken. Then the courtroom erupted. Sarah's mother made a sound somewhere between a sob and a cry, her hand covering her mouth as tears poured down her face. Gasped audibly. Judge's expression hardened into something crystalline and absolute. Michael's face cycled through a series of colors, pale, red, ashen, as if his body couldn't decide how to process the accusation his daughter had just made. His attorney placed both hands on his arm, essentially pinning him to his chair, preventing him from making any kind of dramatic response that would further damage his case. Robert was already on his feet, objecting vociferously, claiming that the therapeutic dog approach was inherently biased and coercive, that Sarah had been coached or manipulated into saying what the judge wanted to hear. But Judge simply raised her hand, and he fell silent immediately. There was something in the judge's expression that suggested she was beyond argument at this point. She had heard what she needed to hear. Sarah, alarmed by the sudden chaos, immediately clung more tightly to Justice. The dog responded by pressing his body more firmly against the child, providing reassurance through his physical presence. Officer placed his other hand on Sarah's shoulder, silently communicating that she was protected, that she was safe, that what she'd done took incredible courage. "That's enough," Judge said, her voice like steel. "We're taking a 15-minute recess. Officer, I'd like to speak with you and Sarah in my chambers immediately. Ms., you'll accompany them. Mr., you may bring one representative if you wish." She banged her gavel once, a decisive, conclusive sound. "This court is in recess." As officers and court personnel began moving, Jennifer stood up as if to follow Sarah, but Judge caught her eye and shook her head subtly. This next phase needed to happen without the parents present, without the lawyer's strategic input, with only those individuals whose purpose was to genuinely understand and protect Sarah's. Officer stood, gently encouraging Sarah to stand as well. The little girl's small hand remained locked in Justice's fur, unwilling to relinquish the connection that had given her the courage to speak her truth. As they walked toward the judge's chambers, Sarah looked back at her mother one final time, and even from across the courtroom, Jennifer could see the question in her daughter's eyes. "Did I do the right thing?" Jennifer nodded emphatically, mouthing the words, "I'm so proud of you, baby." And with that affirmation, Sarah allowed herself to be led away, Justice at her side, Officer beside her, toward a conversation that would reshape her entire future and expose truths that had been buried beneath layers of fear and confusion for far too long. Judge's chambers were nothing like the formal, imposing courtroom. The space was deliberately designed to be warmer, more inviting, with comfortable furniture, soft lighting, and personal touches that suggested the judge had a life outside these walls. Photographs of her family lined the images of A Vacation to Yellowstone, a picture of her with her husband Robert at some charity event. A small fountain burbled quietly in the corner, adding a soothing ambient sound. There were even toys, a collection of blocks, stuffed animals, and picture books, carefully organized in a low shelf that children could easily access. Judge had prepared this space years ago, specifically for situations like this one. She'd learned early in her judicial career that sometimes children needed to communicate in environments that didn't remind them of authority, punishment, or the formality of the legal system. This room was designed as a sanctuary, a place where truth could emerge naturally rather than being extracted through intimidation or procedure. Sarah entered the chambers holding tightly to Justice's fur with one hand and Officer's hand with the other. Her body language had shifted again. The brief courage she'd summoned to speak those two words in the courtroom had been consumed by anxiety and uncertainty now that she was away from the public audience. But Justice remained calm, his presence steady and grounding. A social worker named Doctor was already present in the chambers. She was a woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair and the kind of gentle, knowing expression that came from years of working with traumatized children. She'd been called in specifically because of her expertise in trauma-informed interviewing. She knew how to ask questions in ways that didn't plant suggestions or manipulate responses, how to create space for a child's authentic experience to emerge. "Sarah," Doctor said warmly, kneeling down to the child's eye level, "would you like to sit down? We have some comfortable pillows over there." She gestured to a small corner of the room that had been set up with cushions, stuffed animals, and blankets, a deliberately child-scaled environment. Sarah looked uncertain, but Justice moved toward the cushioned area, effectively making the decision for her. Once they were settled, with Sarah sitting on a soft pillow and Justice positioned beside her, her hand continuing to rest on his fur, Doctor began her careful documentation. "Sarah, there are no cameras in this room, and nobody outside this room needs to know exactly what you tell me, except the judge, because the judge needs to know the truth to help keep you safe." Doctor spoke slowly and clearly. "Do you understand that?" Sarah nodded, though her understanding was likely incomplete. How could a 3-year-old truly comprehend the nuances of legal confidentiality and court proceedings? "I'm going to ask you some questions about what happens when you're at your daddy's house," Doctor continued. "And Justice is here because he likes to listen to true things. If you tell me true things, Justice gets happy. Can you try to tell me true things?" "Okay," Sarah whispered. "What happens when you're at Daddy's house?" Doctor asked, keeping the question open-ended and non-leading. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then in halting, childlike language she began to speak. "Daddy gets loud," she said. "His voice is big, really big, and scary." "His voice gets big and scary," Doctor repeated back to her, validating what she'd said. "What happens when his voice gets big and scary?" "I don't know what to do," Sarah continued, her small voice trembling. "I get scared. I hide sometimes, under the bed or in the closet. Sometimes I pretend I'm asleep." Officer was taking careful notes. Judge, who was observing from a slightly removed position, was also documenting everything Sarah said, creating an official record. "Does your daddy ever touch you in a way that hurts you?" Doctor asked carefully, watching Sarah's physical response as she asked the question. Sarah shook her head. "No, but his words hurt my feelings." "Can you tell me about his words?" Doctor prompted gently. Sarah's hand tightened on Justice's fur. The dog pressed his body against her reassuringly. "He tells me I'm bad. He says I'm messy. He says I'm loud. He says I make mistakes and I should know better, he says." Sarah's voice became even smaller. "He says Mommy is a liar and she's trying to make me not like him." Doctor's expression remained neutral and non-judgmental, but Judge, observing from her seated position, felt her certainty crystallize. This was classic emotional abuse, parental alienation, verbal aggression, creation of anxiety and confusion in a child caught between two parents. "When your daddy says those things, how does your body feel?" Doctor asked, an important question designed to help document the physical manifestations of emotional trauma. "My stomach hurts," Sarah said immediately. Like there are butterflies, but they're mean butterflies. They pinch me from inside, and my heart goes really fast, and I can't breathe good." "That must feel very scary," doctor said with genuine compassion. Those are signs your body is feeling scared. That's a very real thing, Sarah. Your body knows when something is scaring you. Over the next hour, Sarah's fragmented account began to paint a disturbing picture. She described instances where her father had yelled at her mother while Sarah was present, creating an environment of tension and fear. She talked about having to be perfect at her father's house to avoid triggering his anger, keeping her toys organized, eating all her food, never asking questions, never expressing needs or wants that might be inconvenient. She described the relief she felt when her mother picked her up for custody exchanges, and the dread that preceded scheduled visits to her father's home. "Do you have bad dreams?" Doctor asked. Sarah nodded emphatically. "Every night when I go to Daddy's, I have dreams that he's yelling and I can't make him stop, and I can't find Mommy, and I'm alone and nobody's coming to get me." Justice occasionally adjusted his position, pressing more firmly against Sarah at moments when her anxiety spiked, his canine intuition allowing him to provide comfort exactly when it was most needed. Doctor also asked about positive aspects of Sarah's relationship with her father, not to lead Sarah away from her truth, but to develop a complete picture. Sarah admitted that sometimes when her father was in a good mood, he could be fun. He'd taken her to the zoo once, and that had been nice. He sometimes helped her with puzzles, and they'd built block towers together. But even these positive memories were complicated by fear. "When he's nice, is that when he's not getting angry?" Doctor asked. "Yeah," Sarah said, "but I never know when he's gonna get angry, so even when he's being nice, I'm still worried." That statement, "I'm still worried," seemed to encapsulate the core of Sarah's trauma. She was living in a state of hypervigilance, unable to relax even during positive interactions because she couldn't predict when the emotional climate would shift and her father's temper would explode. By the time Doctor concluded her interview, she had documented sufficient clinical evidence of emotional abuse, parental alienation, and a child in acute psychological distress. Officers' observations aligned perfectly with the clinical picture. Sarah exhibited classic signs of complex trauma, hypervigilance, anxiety responses, regression, emotional dysregulation, and sleep disturbance. "Thank you for being so brave, Sarah," Doctor said as the interview concluded. "You told me the truth, and that was very important. Judge is going to use what you told me to help keep you safe." Sarah looked at Justice, then at Officer, then at Doctor. There was a question in her eyes that transcended her limited vocabulary. "Will it be okay now?" Officer gently placed his hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You did the right thing," he said simply. "What you said today, it took courage, real courage, and it's going to help people understand what you need to feel safe." As they prepared to leave the judge's chambers and return to the courtroom, Sarah remained close to Justice, drawing strength from the dog's steady, accepting presence. Whatever came next, she had accomplished something extraordinary. She had spoken her truth, and in doing so, she had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately protect her and potentially change how the entire legal system approached custody cases involving young children. Judge sat alone in her chambers for several moments after they'd left, reviewing her notes and doctor's documentation. The evidence was now clear, irrefutable, and ethically binding. She had no choice but to act decisively to protect this child from the emotionally harmful environment she was being subjected to. 3 days passed between Sarah's testimony and Judge's ruling. 3 days during which the entire legal system seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a decision that would reverberate through Kentucky's family court system for years to come. For Michael Mitchell, those 3 days were an agonizing eternity of uncertainty. His attorney's confident predictions from earlier in the case, now replaced with grim silence and strategic repositioning. For Jennifer, those 3 days were a strange mixture of hope and anxiety. Hope that her daughter would be protected, anxiety about what the future would hold for a child who had such trauma. Sarah spent those 3 days with her grandmother. had taken a leave of absence from her job as a librarian to be fully present for her granddaughter. They'd established new routines designed to help Sarah feel safe and supported. They'd visited doctor for a preliminary play therapy session. They'd attended a pediatric appointment where Sarah's pediatrician had confirmed that her vital signs, which had been elevated during her anxiety episodes, were beginning to normalize. They'd gone to the park and watched ducks on a pond. They'd baked cookies together, was doing everything she could to rebuild a sense of security and normalcy in her granddaughter's life, while they waited for the legal system to do the same. Friday morning arrived with clear skies and autumn sunshine that seemed incongruent with the weight of what was about to occur. The courtroom was already filling with people when Jennifer and Sarah arrived. Word had spread through the courthouse about the unconventional hearing, about the therapy dog and the 3-year-old's revelations. Courthouse employees and even some attorneys from other cases had found reasons to be present, watching the machinery of justice work in a new and unprecedented way. Officer was there, though not with justice. The dog's therapeutic work was complete. His presence was no longer necessary. Sat in the gallery, his dress uniform immaculate, representing both the police department and the legitimacy of the process that had unfolded. Michael sat at the defendant's table with Robert beside him. Michael's face was haggard, as if 3 days of uncertainty had aged him 5 years. He'd evidently not slept well. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his jaw bore several days' worth of stubble. His attorney had advised him not to speak unless directly addressed by the judge, to maintain composure regardless of the ruling, and to accept whatever consequences came with a minimum of visible reaction. It was legal counsel, designed to minimize additional damage to a case that was already in ruins. Judge entered the courtroom at 10:00 a.m. sharp, and the room fell into absolute silence. She was carrying a thick folder containing her written decision. Her expression was calm but unmistakably serious, the expression of someone who had reached conclusions that she was about to enforce with the full authority of her judicial position. She settled into her chair, adjusted her glasses, and without preamble began to read. Her voice was measured and authoritative, each word carefully articulated for the official court record. In the matter of Mitchell v. Mitchell, custody of minor child Sarah Mitchell, I have reviewed all evidence presented, including but not limited to medical records, behavioral assessments, testimony from educational professionals, clinical interviews conducted by doctor, observations documented by Officer James and his certified therapy animal justice, and the nonverbal communication exhibited by the minor child throughout these proceedings. Jennifer reached over and gripped Sarah's hand. Sarah remained silent, though her eyes were wide as she watched the judge speak, trying to understand the gravity of what was unfolding. The evidence before this court, while initially appearing conflicting and ambiguous, has been clarified through an innovative and ultimately revealing approach that allowed the minor child to express her emotional truth in an environment where she felt sufficiently safe to do so. The child's account, corroborated by clinical observation and professional assessment, indicates a pattern of emotional abuse, verbal aggression, parental alienation, and exposure to an environment that has created acute anxiety and trauma responses in a child of only 3 years old. Michael's hands gripped the table in front of him so tightly his knuckles turned white. While there is no evidence of physical abuse in the traditional sense, the emotional harm documented in this case is equally damaging and equally consequential to a child's psychological development. The child exhibits signs of complex trauma including hypervigilance, anxiety responses, sleep disturbance, regression in developmental milestones, and a pervasive fear response associated with the defendant. Judge removed her glasses and looked directly at Michael, and in that moment her judicial neutrality was replaced, however briefly, with something more human, a profound disappointment and disapproval. Therefore, it is the order of this court that primary custody of Sarah Mitchell is hereby granted to her mother, Jennifer Mitchell. The defendant, Michael Mitchell, will have no unsupervised visitation rights pending completion of court-ordered anger management classes and parenting education, specifically focused on emotional development and child-centered communication. A sound that might have been a sob escaped Michael's throat. His attorney placed a hand on his arm, but Michael seemed unable to process what was happening. Furthermore, Judge continued, her voice taking on a different quality, this court finds the approach utilized in these proceedings, the employment of a certified therapy animal to facilitate safe emotional expression in a traumatized child, to be both ethically sound and potentially revolutionary in its application to family court cases. The conventional adversarial approach to custody disputes often fails young children who lack the cognitive and linguistic capacity to articulate their experiences through traditional legal testimony. She paused, and her gaze swept across the courtroom, making eye contact with several attorneys present. I am recommending to the Kentucky Family Court Association that serious consideration be given to developing protocols for the integration of certified therapy animals into custody proceedings involving children under age 5. The evidence suggests that this approach can reveal emotional truth that conventional methods fail to access, thereby better serving the paramount interest of the child. Judge then specifically commended officer and justice for their professionalism and compassion. She noted that the police department should receive consideration for additional funding to expand their therapy dog program to include regular collaboration with the court system. She also praised doctors' clinical work and initial advocacy for Sarah's. I also wish to note, Judge said, her voice carrying particular weight, that in my judicial experience, I have witnessed many cases where children were placed in custody arrangements that were not in their best interests because the system lacked adequate tools to access their authentic experience. This case demonstrates that when we provide children with the proper environment and support, they are capable of extraordinary honesty and courage. 3-year-old Sarah Mitchell demonstrated more courage in speaking 2 words in this courtroom than many adults demonstrate in a lifetime. Jennifer's face was streaming with tears now, tears of relief, of vindication, of overwhelming emotion. The defendant will begin anger management classes within 30 days. Court-ordered parenting education will be mandatory before unsupervised contact can be resumed. A review hearing will be scheduled in 6 months to assess progress and make recommendations regarding the possibility of graduated visitation increases. Sarah Mitchell will be provided with ongoing play therapy and psychological support to address the trauma she has experienced. Judge banged her gavel once, a decisive sound that echoed through the courtroom with finality. This court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted. Jennifer pulled Sarah into her arms, holding her daughter close as tears of gratitude and sorrow flowed down her face. From the gallery, wiped her own tears away, whispering prayers of thanksgiving. Officer nodded solemnly, understanding the significance of what had just transpired. Court personnel and observers discussed the ruling in hushed, urgent tones, recognizing that they had just witnessed legal history in the making. Michael sat frozen at his table, his attorney speaking urgently to him, but Michael seemed unable to hear or respond. The reality of his situation was finally settling into his consciousness. He had lost custody. He was being forced into treatment, and his relationship with his daughter was now mediated by the legal system, contingent on his willingness to change behavior patterns that had been ingrained for years. As officers prepared to process the paperwork and finalize the custody transfer, Jennifer stood with Sarah in her arms, and for the first time in 3 months, both mother and daughter wore expressions that suggested they might, finally, feel safe enough to breathe. 2 years had passed since Sarah spoke those 2 transformative words in Judge's courtroom. The little girl sitting in Dr. Rachel's office, the same pediatrician who had first noticed the bruises and had the courage to report them, was virtually unrecognizable compared to the anxious, withdrawn child who had arrived in court with a worn teddy bear and uncertain future. At 5 years old, Sarah was now a vibrant, curious, intelligent kindergartner who laughed freely, asked endless questions about the world around her, and had rediscovered the simple joys of childhood that had been stolen from her during those terrible months. Her classroom teacher, Mrs., reported that Sarah was a delight, engaged, creative, and developing strong social connections with her peers. The nightmares had mostly ceased after the first year of play therapy. The stomach aches that had plagued her during her time with her father were now distant memories. Her appetite had returned to normal, and she'd gained the weight she'd lost during the anxiety-riddled custody battle. Most importantly, the haunted quality that had shadowed her eyes had been replaced by the clear, innocent sparkle that should characterize a child her age. The recovery hadn't been instantaneous or easy. There had been setbacks. Sarah had experienced regressions during her transitions between her mother's home and grandmother's apartment. She'd had panic attacks the first few times she was in enclosed spaces that reminded her of hiding in closets at her father's house. Doctor had worked with her patiently through play therapy, helping Sarah process her trauma in age-appropriate ways. They'd done sand tray therapy, where Sarah had recreated her experiences and then reimagined them with different outcomes. They'd done art therapy, where Sarah's drawings had gradually shifted from dark, violent images to bright, hopeful ones. Jennifer had been instrumental in Sarah's recovery. She'd attended parenting classes specifically designed to help parents of trauma-affected children. She'd read countless books about childhood trauma and resilience. She'd learned to recognize Sarah's triggers and respond with calm, consistent reassurance rather than reactivity. She'd created predictable routines and safety protocols that allowed Sarah's nervous system to gradually downregulate from its constant state of hypervigilance. Most importantly, she'd loved her daughter with a fierce, unwavering dedication that communicated on every level that Sarah was safe, valued, and worthy of protection. Had also been crucial to Sarah's healing. The bond between grandmother and granddaughter had deepened considerably, had become Sarah's safe haven, the person she could retreat to when the world felt overwhelming. They developed rituals, Saturday morning pancakes, afternoon trips to the library, evening foot massages while they watched age-appropriate movies. Had modeled for Sarah what unconditional love looked like, and in doing so, had helped repair some of the damage that had been inflicted. Michael Mitchell's journey had been considerably more complicated. The first 6 months following Judge's ruling had been difficult for him. He'd attended anger management classes with obvious resistance, sitting in a circle with other men, listening to a therapist explain concepts about emotional regulation and communication that contradicted everything he believed about masculinity and parental authority. But something had begun to shift around month 4. He'd had a conversation with the parenting education instructor, a woman named Dr. Lisa Martinez, who specialized in helping parents understand the emotional development of young children. When you yell at Sarah, Dr. Martinez had explained, you're not disciplining her, you're traumatizing her. Her developing brain literally cannot distinguish between anger directed at her and personal danger. From her perspective, her primary caregiver is a threat. That's what you're teaching her when you lose your temper. Something in those words had penetrated the defensive walls Michael had constructed around himself. He'd begun to confront uncomfortable truths about his own childhood. His father had been verbally abusive, had yelled constantly, and Michael had essentially replicated that pattern with his own daughter. For the first time in his life, Michael began to understand that his behavior wasn't just affecting Sarah in the present moment. It was potentially setting up generational trauma that could echo through his family line for decades to come. The supervised visitations that followed had been awkward and painful. Michael would pick Sarah up, typically taking her to a park or a neutral location like a museum, with a court-appointed supervisor observing from a discreet distance. Sarah remained wary of him for many months, She would comply with his presence but wouldn't relax or open up. Slowly, however, as Michael maintained consistent, gentle, non-aggressive behavior over many months, Sarah began to cautiously engage with him again. She would accept his hand during walks. She would laugh at his jokes. She would, eventually, allow him to hug her goodbye. Michael had completed his anger management classes. He'd attended the parenting education program in its entirety. He'd even sought out individual therapy with a psychologist specializing in trauma and family dynamics. His supervisor in the first hearing recommended supervised visitation be expanded to supervised overnight stays. Eventually, after 18 months of consistent, positive interaction, Judge approved a gradual increase in unsupervised visitation. The 6-month review hearing had been the first checkpoint. Judge had reviewed Michael's progress, heard reports from the visitation supervisor, and consulted with Sarah's therapist. She decided to allow supervised overnight visits to resume. At the 1-year review, the judge had authorized unsupervised weekend visits, provided Michael continued his therapy, and demonstrated continued emotional regulation. By the 2-year mark, Michael had rebuilt enough of a relationship with his daughter that occasional overnight stays were permitted, contingent on continued psychological support. It wasn't a complete restoration of the previous relationship. That foundation had been too damaged. But it was a new relationship, built on different terms, one where Michael was slowly learning to be the father Sarah needed rather than the person his trauma history had made him. The case had had profound ripple effects beyond the Mitchell family. Judge recommendations had been taken seriously by the Kentucky Family Court Association. A committee had been formed to develop protocols for therapy dog integration into family court proceedings. 3 additional K-9 handlers had been trained and certified. Police departments across Kentucky had begun receiving grant funding to expand their therapy dog programs specifically for court services. Officer had become something of a celebrity in judicial circles. He'd been invited to present at legal conferences. He'd been interviewed for legal journals and even some national news outlets. The Justice case, as it came to be known, had become a landmark precedent for trauma-informed justice practices. Justice, now 6 years old, had become the face of a new movement within the legal system. He'd been featured in a documentary about innovative approaches to family court. He'd received commendations from the mayor's office and the police department. He'd been the subject of a children's book titled Justice the Court Dog, which was now used in schools to teach children about the legal system and about the importance of speaking truth. But perhaps most importantly, Justice had helped establish the principle that sometimes the most powerful way to serve justice is through compassion, patience, and recognition of our shared vulnerability as human beings. Sarah, now 5 years old, was thriving in ways that extended far beyond the absence of trauma symptoms. She was resilient, intelligent, and possessed an empathy that seemed almost unusual for someone so young. She understood on some level that her experience had mattered, that her truth had changed things, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was speak honestly about their fear. She'd even asked to visit Justice one more time, something that Officer had facilitated through the police department's community outreach program. Sarah had hugged the dog with the pure, uncomplicated affection of a child who understood that this animal had been instrumental in saving her life. Justice had responded with his typical gentle warmth, his tail wagging, his eyes reflecting the simple, profound knowledge that he had done his job well. As Jennifer watched her daughter play in the park, running, laughing, climbing on playground equipment with the unself-conscious joy that characterized healthy childhood, she felt profound gratitude for the system that, despite its imperfections, had ultimately protected her child. She thought about Judge's courage in trying something unconventional. She thought about Officer's compassion and professionalism. She thought about Justice's inexplicable ability to create safety in spaces where fear had previously reigned. But most of all, she felt gratitude for Sarah's own resilience. for a 3-year-old's remarkable ability to speak truth despite overwhelming fear, and for the journey that had transformed trauma into healing, fear into courage, and despair into hope. The case of Mitchell v. Mitchell would be studied in law schools for years to come. But for Sarah, it was simply the story of how she'd found her voice, how she'd learned that her truth mattered, and how a gentle dog and a courageous community had helped her reclaim the childhood that had been stolen from her. In the end, justice had been served, not through punishment, but through protection, healing, and the extraordinary power of allowing a child's authentic truth to reshape an entire system.